Okay, thanks, Greg. And it's really an honor to be here and to be invited to give the Wenck Lecture. And as I learned more about Professor Wenck and the interdisciplinary interest of his in specifically linking policy and social sciences with civil engineering, I felt really truly honored to be a part of this. And you know, I think it's really appropriate that Greg brought up the sort of the merging of, or not the merging, but the interface of our two units. We can look at civil engineering as the interface between society and the environment, and we can look at SEFS, or the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, sort of that interface between the natural environment and society, and we interface through environment. So anyhow, I feel really honored to be here today. I'm just going to make one quick acknowledgement, and that's Steve Anderson with the Forest History Society. Steve provided me with some images and also some information that was very helpful in putting this talk together. One, Greg did sort of steal my thunder a little bit in mentioning my wife, Denise, but I thought I would just mention this is the University of Wisconsin, the other UW, and this is where I did my bachelor's degree, and I transferred there my sophomore year, and one of the first things I wanted to do was meet a beautiful woman. And so, did I go to Langdon Street, the sorority row? No. Did I go to the LVM Art Center? No. Did I go to the Union? No. I went to Civil and Environmental Engineering Department and met the woman of my life. And I'm still married to her today. I don't know how she's put up with that, but nonetheless. So the reason why I mention that is that's one of the relationships that I hold with civil and environmental engineering, is the fact that I'm married to an engineer. But the other aspect is that, as Greg said, there's been a long history, a shared history between our two units. And I'm going to talk about that in some detail today. But as you noted at the title slide, I put sustainability in the title of my slide, and the quest for the 21st century. And so what I'd like to do is start off with discussing just a little bit around the term sustainability and sort of focus our attention along those lines, and then move on to talk about our shared history, and then talk a little bit about who we are today, and just highlight a few of the people within the school and their research, and then finish with a current topic where I see a lot of overlap between the two units, and specifically dealing with this issue of sustainability. So, and doing so in a systems-based, shared and systems-based approach. Okay. So sustainability, it's one of those words, I'm sure that when some of you looked at it, you probably rolled your eyes or even groaned, because the term has been heavily used and sometimes abused and used in inappropriate ways. But it actually is a term that makes an enormous amount of sense. If we can't function sustainably with our management of our ecosystems and our urban living systems, then we're in a lot of trouble. So I've just put up a simple definition of sustainability, one that I think would generate the fewest arguments in the room, and it's one where it's a system where human needs are indefinitely met, and just met, not grossly overindulged, without the degradation of the environment, okay? Sustainability isn't without its critics. As I said, there's probably some folks that might roll their eyes at the term, but and some just say it just doesn't simply go far enough. But there's others that might think otherwise. And if you saw this article, this editorial in Science just earlier this year, the Pope organized a workshop with the religious leaders from all around the world to tackle this issue of sustainability, recognizing that climate change is a very, very significant threat to, in the Pope's terms, God's earth. And so this is sustainability, the concept of sustainability is obviously taken seriously by many. This is sort of that conventional view of sustainability, and it's a two-dimensional view of sustainability, and one that's wrought with problems. And I say wrought with problems because if we look at this, the idea is if you're maximizing profit, you're at 10 on the profit scale on the vertical axis in 2 dimensions, then you're minimizing the condition of the environment. You're damaging the environment. On the other extreme, if you're maximizing the protection of environmental resources, then you're minimizing profit. And it's described as this balance between the two. And I don't seem to have a laser pointer, but if we were out where I have the arrows pointing, nobody's ever satisfied. You're not, that would be the realm of sustainability, somewhere out at where the arrow is pointing, and yet you're neither maximizing environmental conditions nor profit. And if we take this from a timber management perspective, we might say the first trees cut in a natural ecosystem, we would have been just stepping off of the environmental 10. And as we moved into heavier thinning or heavier extraction, ultimately to clear cutting, and then perhaps over extraction and degradation of the environment, we're looking at this and saying, well, sustainability is somewhere between over extraction and the first trees cut, and it's not a particularly fulfilling way to look at sustainability. So I would argue that we can't look at sustainability in a 2-dimensional framework, but rather we might want to lay that framework on its side and put a 3rd dimension in place that describes other factors within the environment and within our lives that definitely need to be included. Now, I could have expanded this list greatly. Inspiration and beauty, creativity, love, clean air, clean water, solitude, value-added products, alternative energy, all these different things that would make up that z-axis and create a 3-dimensional space. And within that, we could imagine nonlinear growth with the development of knowledge and innovation and interdisciplinarity to drive towards these positive outcomes. So I think that we need to expand our perspective on what what sustainability is. But what are some of the constraints and drivers? And these are things that we all are highly aware of. Number one, we're moving to more and more of an urban landscape. We were 25% urban globally speaking in the 1950s, and today we're about 50%. In the US, we're considered to be 80% urban. Okay, so that means we're centralizing our populations, our prime activity, and that puts demands on resources in rural landscapes and creates challenges in our urban environs as well. We can imagine a steady flow of nutrients, energy, and resources out of our rural landscapes and into these urban centers through different forms of industry and processing, and then ultimately we're looking to get rid of our nutrients because it become a problem concentrated in these in our urban environs. So we end up trying to minimize the presence of the drive nitrogen off to the atmosphere and minimize the phosphorus in the waste in our wastewater, and instead of trying to return those nutrients and resources to the landscape. We also have the challenges of climate change, and we've known about these challenges for a long time, and yet action on them is slow to come. This is an older figure from Moat from here at Washington, with the red circles indicating trends in annual temperature increases. The figure on the upper right-hand corner is from a paper of ours on the inland Northwest in looking at August stream flows and the change in August stream flows with over the last 50 years. And this increase in drying conditions in summer months and increased temperatures leads to a longer and more severe fire season, and we've obviously observed significant increase in pest infestations in the region as well. So when we look to start addressing these issues of sustainability, just the fact that it crosses urban and rural boundaries, and the fact that it deals with entomology and deals with engineering issues and deals with fire ecology and an array of subjects, it becomes clear that sustainability can only be addressed by the integration of knowledge across a number of disciplines, and thus so appropriate to be giving this as a Wenck lecture. Okay, so let's look at some of the history in our shared history, and this is an image from Seattle waterfront circa 1895. And here we have logs being moved out onto the waterfront by a team of oxen. And you can imagine the slow and tortuous pathway to get logs out of the woods and down to the dock, down to the waterfront for processing. And you see the wedding of engineering with the dock and the pillars for the dock, and then the logs being moved as part of the forest timber removal. And you can see also in the background Seattle being a large clear cut at the time. And it's important to note that with these teams of oxen, you wouldn't have been able to move timber more than 1.5 miles, a mile at the most, and make it profitable, so that teams of oxen were highly inefficient, even though here you see that the logs are being moved on skids through the woods. So they were trying to innovate with these challenges. And ultimately, engineering really facilitated timber management and timber harvest throughout the Pacific Northwest. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, you see what's called a steam donkey. And this is a device that literally winched through steam energy, winched trees out of the woods, allowing trees to be taken from a longer distance away than would have been feasible with oxen, and much more efficiently. And of course, with the introduction of rail and specifically small gauge rail, the timber was being moved miles away from waterfronts and from woods to waterfront. With that extraction, of course, the extraction was accelerating, and the timber extraction was accelerating, and there were a few vocal critics of this in this era, and the ones that we're all familiar with are individuals like John Muir and whatnot. But I highlight a couple of individuals you may not be familiar with. This is George Bird Grinnell, who was the editor of a periodical by the name of Forest and Stream. And in the April 13th issue in 1882, he wrote an editorial in which he says, "No woods, no game, no woods, no water, no fish," and was sounding the alarm that we were destroying our resources of our wildlife and water resources through over-extraction of timber. And I should just mention that this individual was the co-founder of Boone and Crockett Club. For those of you that aren't familiar, it was established by Teddy Roosevelt as a hunting and conservation club. And this is another individual of the era, Charles Sprague Sargent. He had been educated at Harvard and became the director at the Harvard Arboretum, and ultimately was made chair of the National Forest Commission. So there was a commission that was looking at, number one, we had already heavily logged the Northeast, then the North Central, and now we were logging the Northwest at a breakneck pace. And this commission was recognizing we had our few intact resources left. We needed to conserve these. And so this individual had written at length on the topic, and one quote that I have here is, "The methods adopted by lumbermen of Western Washington are wasteful in the extreme." He goes on to talk about how timber is cut at 12 to 20 feet high to avoid the thick bark on the bottoms of the trees, and just referring to the wastefulness of forest management during that era. And so he was responsible for the establishment of the first forest reserves. So these are the limited forest reserves established in Wyoming, of all places, a place with a minimal amount of forest cover. Wyoming, Oregon, California, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. President Harrison came along and then expanded that forest reserve program to include a number of forests here in Washington, including out on the Olympic Peninsula and in the North Cascades. And this continues to increase through Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And here are the national forests by 1907. With the establishment of the Forest Service, the first chief of the Forest Service was Gifford Pinchot. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name Pinchot, but he is famous in forestry circles as a pragmatist, but also a conservationist. And he was alarmed by the condition of our forests in the West and said that forests needed to be treated as working capital to produce successive crops. So he thought of it in a really practical sense, that we needed to be looking at future generations, not only for our kids' sake, but also just for the wealth and well-being of the nation. And he said a working plan must be established and followed and leave standing trees and the young growth nearly unharmed. So those were pretty radical words in 1905 for a forester at least. And at the same time comes the School of Forestry. Just actually in 1901, the first courses were being taught on campus in forestry, and they formed a department. But the School of Forestry was actually formed in 1907. And this school was formed to address the need for conservation of our national forests. And to train, specifically train the foresters that would populate the ranks of Gifford Pinchot's new army of Forest Service employees. Unfortunately, it never really worked out that way because it didn't work out that way early on because the Forest Service was so poorly funded that they couldn't actually hire the army of individuals that they had intended to. So the School of Forestry sort of retrenched in spite of the fact that we were geared towards public lands management initially, thinking towards public lands management. We also engaged in the training of logging engineering. There we are again, bound to our cousins in civil and environmental engineering through the teaching of logging engineering. I point out this building here. This was the first building. We were first housed in another building as a department, but our first building as a school of forestry was in this building, the Good Roads building. How many of you have heard of the Good Roads building? A few of you. My understanding, it's a building that was built by individuals that were intent on having reliable roads in the Seattle area. And they insisted that this building must maintain the name Good Roads Building because they funded the building of the building. And of course, I think civil engineering was housed in this as well, but I'm not sure. But forestry would try to put their label, a banner up that said School of Forestry, and it kept getting torn down by the administration. And finally, they forced the faculty to never put up a banner again, or they would be thrown out of the building altogether. Anyhow, so this is the first dean of the School of Forestry. You know, it was a School of Forestry at that time, so we've come full circle. We were a School of Forestry then. We became a College of Forestry and then a College of Forest Resources. And now we're back to being a School of Forestry, a School of Environmental and Forest Sciences now. But the objectives of the school under the direction of Dean Miller, no relation. The objectives of was the instruction of forest sciences. That's a big deal because we weren't just instructing technology or techniques for the management of timber. We were teaching the science of forestry. People were learning botany, they were learning physiology, they were learning silviculture, and also learning engineering as well, some logging engineering as well. And they emphasized this was for the right use of forest resources. These were radical ideas at the time. We were pushing limits a bit, and it wasn't particularly, my understanding, it wasn't well appreciated by the lumbering industry of the time. We were trying to get away from that attitude or that logic of cut out and get out. That's a quote by Miller, actually, and replacing that with a concept of forestry. So forestry would be conservation as opposed to that of lumbering. The school continued to develop over time and ultimately became a college. Hugo Winkenwerder, there's a building on campus named after him, is one of our buildings. And he was the first dean of the College of Forestry. And the college then had, in addition to the faculty that were indeed forestry faculty, included faculty from physics, math, engineering, social sciences, and geology. So already we had somewhat of an interdisciplinary program that was forming in forestry, and that relates to the fact that you can't manage a forest without understanding of a fairly broad, you can't sustainably manage a forest without a fairly broad understanding of the sciences. So in about 1917, there was a move by the faculty council at that time to merge engineering, the College of Engineering, with the College of Forestry. And I know it was resisted strongly by the faculty of forestry because they saw this the engineering side of the school being emphasized and the conservation and forestry end of things being minimized. And they resisted strongly, and ultimately the Board of Regents sided with the faculty, and they remained a College of Forestry. And then at this point, in about 1917, the new term of the era was sustainable yield forestry. So again, sustainability has already shown up in the terminology being used in the school. This is Anderson Hall, our current building, built in 1928, and I won't go into any detail on it, except I love this picture of the timber cruisers camp that is right outside of Anderson Hall. I think we should reproduce that. Maybe the president would allow us to keep it right up on the quad. That might actually even be better. Anyhow, so forestry in Washington from 1920 to 1940 was going through you can see it almost like a circus ride in terms of the up and down associated with the production. We were on a trajectory upward, and by 1920, timber harvest in Washington was at 7 billion board feet per year. That's an enormous rate of timber removal in the state of Washington, and it was certainly unsustainable. It couldn't be maintained at that level for indefinitely. And just to put this in perspective, you took 7 billion board feet and lined them up end by end, and you would be able to go around the equator, circumnavigate the equator 53 times. That's how much wood that was, an enormous amount of wood. And this drops dramatically with the onset of the Depression, and then begins to recover in 1940 with the demand for wood for war. And there's an enormous amount of wood that was used in the war, and sort of began the recovery of the forest industry after the big dip. You might be asking yourself, where was all that wood going? Well, maybe you wouldn't. You're engineers. You probably already know. But of course, it was going to things like mining. Just building a mine shaft, you can imagine the number of stays that go into a mine shaft, or building the rail, the transcontinental rail, and all the railroad ties are wood. And so just the enormous amount of infrastructure, of course, buildings, tall buildings. Here in Seattle, we still have 10-story buildings downtown that are wood construction buildings. And so both small frame houses as well as large buildings were wood-based and up until 1920. There was a huge demand for wood. At the same time, we had the conservation movement building. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, most of us are familiar with the names Leopold and Marshall and Muir, Rachel Carson. These were movers of the environmental movement and also the preservation movement. So the preservation movement was a group of individuals that looked at the land and said, of these forest reserves, we need to take some of these that haven't been trammeled yet and put them into preservation indefinitely. And Leopold was one of the leading voices in this arena. And Leopold was a forester. He was a Yale-trained forester, and he later becomes a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And his influence is all over the place in the Midwest, and obviously in the West with ultimately the land preservation that was undertaken eventually. But at the same time, so we have this conservation movement and preservation movement underway. We have the forestry school teaching sustainable forest management and sustainable yield forestry. But through the 50s through the 70s, timber harvest on public lands in particular became extremely heavy. The Forest Service became the #1 road building entity in the nation for a while, and was built, just for example, 59,000 miles of logging road in Montana in the late 50s alone. So they were building an enormous amount of roads. And of course, there again is our relationship with civil engineering. We learn how to build roads from the engineers, of course. But poorly built roads, you can see those in the lower part of the screen, are a major problem for forest management, and ultimately led to big changes in the way forests were managed because of the sedimentation of streams. We sort of lost our compass during this era in terms of forest conservation. And at the same time, there was a number of engineering innovations that were improving the efficiency of resource extraction, and in some cases actually reduced impacts, getting logs off the ground so you weren't skidding with tractors, but rather with high lines that would, even though it facilitated more rapid removal, also reduce soil compaction. But there was a number of unintended consequences of the heavy rate of forest management that was going on at the time. And these were things like sedimentation of streams, high temperature in streams, loss of salmonids all through the inland Northwest. And there were some really gross errors made by the Forest Service during this era. And a couple of them were called out. And one in particular that I'll mention, because I've actually done research on these sites down in the Bitterroot in Montana, was the terracing of forests in Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. And here what was happening is they were clear cutting these steep slopes, and then to facilitate machine planting came in and bulldozed in terraces, just like you might do if you were putting in a banana plantation in Tenerife or something. And people looked at these and they were just shocked. And for the first time, the public became really vocal about, this has got to stop. This is a foreign landscape. I don't even recognize this. And Arnie Boley at the University of Montana was charged with writing this report by Lee Metcalf, I believe, that charged him, Senator Metcalf charged him with writing this report, and it was just damning of the activities by the Forest Service at the time, and saying that very thing, that the Forest Service had lost its compass and the conservation of its forest resources. And it led to lawsuits, and it led to really significant changes in the way the Forest Service was able to manage their lands. They were forced to follow NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and conduct environmental reviews for forest management activities. And ultimately, it was the beginning of a major shift. The emphasis moving away from timber action and more towards managing for habitat, managing for biodiversity, but still that interest in volume. Can we get timber at the same time? But the changes in the environmental laws made it almost impossible to get ultimately to get the volume. And we'll talk about that a little later on. So this is from an article that just showed up in Science just literally a couple of weeks ago. And it shows that sort of shift in the framing of conservation over time from the 1960s, when the preservation movement really got its foothold, and that would have been in that era of the Boley Report, and the establishment of the Wilderness Act, 1964. This is the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act this year. And that was all about managing to protect these lands, to protect species, to protect habitat, and so managing for nature itself. In the 80s and 90s, we see sort of a modification of this and looking at can we manage for populations of organisms and dealing with threatened species and pollution and overexploitation. And this we look at in terms of nature despite the people. More recently, we see the sort of ecosystem services perspective showing up. And here, the ecosystem functions are emphasized, but it's very human-centric. It's looking at it as, what's nature provide people, and can we economically account for this? And now, moving to 2010 and beyond, that the questions of people and nature, can we manage for both? And with, I guess, more of a altruistic perspective. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and come around to talk about the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences that exists today. And the school today is fairly diverse, both in terms of in terms of what the faculty cover. We have individuals within the school, of course, that address forest management, silviculture, and forest mensuration and optimization. We have individuals that focus on the impacts of climate change on species and species migration. We have individuals that study remote sensing, water resources. Our latest hire of David Buttman is a biogeochemist, water biogeochemist. The human dimensions of natural resource management. We have just recently had Peter Kahn, a psychologist, join our school along with 3 other social scientists. We have our ecological forestry being addressed by ecologists within the group. We still have a pulp and paper engineering program that is now focusing more and more on biofuels and bioproducts. But paper, of course, is a bioproduct that we are all in love with. We like the tactile sense of it. And when the comparison for me of reading a book made of paper compared to turning pages on a Kindle or on a tablet, there's no comparison. I'd much rather read a book. So anyhow, so this is the diversity of what makes up the school. And just to give a little bit of highlight of a couple of these things and what the individuals are doing, this is from a study by Josh Lawler, one of our landscape ecologists that studies climate change, and looking at modeled results over a 100-year period of 500 different mammals in North and South America, and looking at their ability to migrate in the face of 100 years of climate change and keep up with that, migrate to keep up with the pace of the warming climate. And they found that the bright red areas are where 40% of the species would not be able to keep pace. The black is where 0. The average ended up coming out for North and South America to about 8%. But those hot spots are really the areas where I think that one would want to focus. This is an image of a modeling simulation with Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson. Norm's actually down at Oregon State University. But this is an example of trying to move away from clear-cut forestry, which is in the backdrop, and use this variable retention forestry, which it combines early cereal habitat, because it's recognized that you can't just have all late succession habitat. That's not the way the forests were naturally anyhow. So some combination of early cereal habitat, mature trees, and something in between. And this is just an example of the work that Jerry's doing. He's also doing a bunch of work on the east side of Washington with the reestablishing natural fire regimes and the natural processes of fire in those landscapes. I mentioned remote sensing specialization within the school. This is an example of work being done by Monica Moskal, who works with LiDAR, or aerial laser scanning, and also terrestrial laser scanning. The aerial laser scanning in the upper part of the image shows that we can do amazing things with inventory now by this LiDAR scanning, and also have a much better sense of habitat characteristics as well. The terrestrial scanning allows us to actually get great images and data on things as detailed as forest volume, or diameter at breast height, or even attempts are being made to look at soil moisture through that terrestrial laser scanning, and of course habitat for endangered species such as the marbled murrelet. Sharon Doty is a microbiologist with us, and Sharon has a long shared relationship with some of the individuals within civil and environmental engineering, and specifically Stuart Strand. But she's been working with endophytes that colonize the specifically willows and poplars, and looking at different characteristics that plant microbiome imparts on trees. And one of the important ones is nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixing poplar trees it's something that hadn't been envisioned before. No trees other than leguminous trees and actinorhizal trees such as alder have been known to fix nitrogen. She's finding that these endophytes that live within the stems of the trees have the capacity to fix nitrogen and increase the productivity of these poplar trees being grown in plantations. And also looking at using the endophytes to impart the capacity to live and degrade toxic chemicals in the environment. Our bioresource science and engineering program, I mentioned that again, I said this earlier, we have an engineering program within the school still, and this is the group that's working on bioproducts and as well as biofuels. And again, our most recent addition to our school, David Buttman, who we share with the civil and environmental faculty, is looking at large-scale watershed carbon and nitrogen dynamics, and specifically looking at carbon with regard to flux rates, and doing some really amazing work with flux rates of CO2 and methane in these environments. And here he demonstrate the sensing of the environment that is being done in these watershed systems to get a better sense of these rates. It looks to me, though, like he's on a fishing trip with that pole that's sitting out there, and I think he is doubling up. I'm not sure, David, maybe you'd like to comment on that. But again, so here's that same statement that I've made earlier today, and I'm going to keep repeating this until we walk out of the room. We'll be thinking about nothing but sustainability can be only addressed by the integration of knowledge and efforts of multiple disciplines. Okay, so even if we have this diversity within our own school, we need to be reaching out across disciplines and throughout the university, including civil and environmental engineering. Okay, so I told a little bit of the history that led to the change, sort of the change over time in forest management and the establishment of the school. Where are we today? And then where the school exists today. So where are we now today with forest management on public lands? Well, with the establishment of the change in the way the laws regarding the way the Forest Service was able to manage lands, and establishment of policies such as the Northwest Forest Plan, the Endangered Species Act, the local habitat conservation plan on state lands geared towards protection of species. And these acts and these plans really have stopped the flow of timber from federal lands. It's down to really just a trickle in Washington, with timber harvest only really occurring at margins and fuel reduction treatments, that type of thing. And discontinued completely the harvesting of old growth and slowed the harvest on state trust lands dramatically. And much of that, such as the discontinuing of the harvest of old growth, is a very positive thing, and the slowing of resource extraction. But the intent was to recover some of these harvested landscapes to their natural splendor. And does 40 years of growth yield habitat? Well, I would argue that it doesn't. And these lands were hit pretty heavily. This image shows the yellow is harvesting, clear-cut harvesting that was taking place in the 70s. The red is clear-cut harvesting taking place in the 80s. And what you see is a shift from state and federal lands. The federal lands are outlined in brown, and that includes the national park, which of course is not being managed. But the clear cutting is hitting in the federal and state lands, and it literally just shifts southward into private land. So we see a discontinuation of the management of those stands. And what's happened in specific locations, such as the Olympic Peninsula, where growth rates of hemlock are unbelievable, is that we don't have natural stands at all. We have very overstocked, dense stands that miss the pre-commercial thin, or so they haven't been being managed for timber, and they will not reach that native old growth condition for hundreds and hundreds of years because of the condition that they're currently in, and because that is a process that's going to take time. It might be able to be facilitated, however, through forest management. So in that sense, some of the abandonment of the federal lands from any management ends up actually not supporting our species of concerns, but may create an opportunity. So here I just ask the question, can we improve habitat, generate products, conduct smart planning, and improve green building all at once? That's a big ask, isn't it? And that's the bullet building down on the right-hand corner, and just a stand here on the west side of the Cascades, and then a east side forest that's recently burned. But to achieve this objective is going to require architects, engineers, planners. And why do we want to use wood? Why would we be anxious to use wood as a building material and get wood out of those, be able to take volume from those forests? Well, number one, wood as a building material is carbon negative. We will literally store carbon in woody structures, and this compares steel studs with green and lumber studs and concrete blocks in terms of just total CO2 equivalent, and it's just for comparison sake. And then most of you will have heard of mass timber construction opportunities that have been happening in Canada and Europe and Australia, and these are using these heavy panel wood products. And the nice thing about these heavy panel wood products, such as cross-laminated timber or laminated veneer lumber, is that you can use relatively small wood to generate incredibly large structural units or panels and beams. And however, that approach has to be wed carefully with sustainable forest management. We can't just say, oh, we've got a new wood product that we can displace steel and concrete with. We have to look at it in terms of how do we manage this forest sustainably to achieve that. This is just a quick example of what these construction sites look like with the panels are literally cut at the mill site. They can have the windows cut into them. They can even have electric wiring and even plumbing fitted to them. And then they're brought out to the site and snapped into place with steel and concrete fittings. And the construction noise on the sites is dropped to minimal, and the construction time is also. And so there's this great deal of interest in the notion of, can we build tall with wood using these structural panels? And there's a number of reasons why these panels have certain really positive features to it. And I just list these out. And I don't want to go into detail on this because I'm assuming that the engineers here already have heard about this in great detail. But the notion that we can build tall with wood and reduce the carbon footprint of our building, especially in urban and suburban areas, and increase the density of the housing, thereby leading to less and less development of rural lands, is really appealing. So can we take these forests that were no longer being managed, that have a hemlock scourge like we see here, where the hemlock grows like a weed on the peninsula. It's just truly amazing how fast hemlock grows. And if it's not managed, you can imagine, people will say, well, a wind throw event is like a clear cut. But it's not like a clear cut at all, because in large wind throw events, there would have been an enormous amount of downfall. And the downfall would inhibit the growth of timber in given areas, and you'd have a much patchier growth. This is growth that follows a lack of post-harvest management. And, but can we take these small diameter roundwood and generate cross-laminated timber? So here we're working with WSU's Wood Lab over in the engineering department at Washington State, and we're mocking up hemlock panels from peninsula wood. And we can now envision having an outlet for small diameter trees to either develop habitat and large trees, so we're able to grow large trees as opposed to this dense growth that will never mature at a proper rate, have a new rotation strategy for intensively managed small diameter roundwood on less desirable landscapes, so areas that we don't have hopes for habitat redevelopment. So what are some of the challenges of that? It sounds like a win-win, and I don't like that term, because if someone's winning, someone's losing, so the whole concept of win-win-win is sort of irritating. But that nonetheless, CLT has not, cross-laminated timber has not been established for any building in the US. We don't have a single mill that's generating cross-laminated timber. Building codes in the US allow for wood to only go to 5 stories tall currently, so codes have to be changed. CLT panels use an awful lot of wood per square foot. Just for example, if we built a house out of CLT, a regular frame house, that might take 40,000 board feet. If we did it with CLT, it would be more like 240,000. Now, that would be completely different. You'd be displacing more steel and concrete building tall with wood. And so it would definitely has most feasibility for tall structures, not for displacing single family dwellings. Okay, but we're going to need integration of knowledge and efforts from multiple disciplines. All right, just to finish with this idea of systems thinking. This just is a cloud with the interaction of the variety of areas that need to be addressed to address this issue of using cross-laminated timber in forest in tall buildings. It involves the forest ecosystem, but also the urban ecosystem. We require architecture and engineering and silviculture, and this is just the beginning of what this would look like in terms of those disciplines that need to be involved in creating a sustainable path to the management, building, and community design. And we might want to use other systems as models for the integration of these networks. And here I have mycelial mats now, mycelial networks put in the context of that cloud. It's going to require a paradigm shift and also a shift in the way that we communicate our research results and research activities with one another. Is that unrealistic to imagine that we can do that? It's just limited to our imagination. You think about where we've come in the last 30 years, from rotary phones to the mobiles we walk around with, or from a slide rule and that Graham grew up with in the whenever it was, to the laptops that we have today, and they have here a hover drone. Can we imagine harvesting timber with hover drones that create absolutely no soil compaction, just a sawyer on the ground rather than a Ford or Feller buncher? And it becomes obvious that we absolutely can accomplish these things. So I finish with a quote from Cahill Gibran, which is that let there be no purpose in friendship save the deepening of the spirit. So we expect nothing from our friendship with civil and environmental engineering beyond that we'll be better together. But I think that we can accomplish amazing things together. There are really enormous challenges out there, and we have a wonderful shared history and a really bright future. And with that, I'll say thanks.
We have time for a couple questions and answers. Maybe. Graham.
Okay, so Graham is asking the question of how can these two units combining advance innovation and creativity in the university setting. The university was envisioned in the Renaissance to get away from colleges, to get away from single thought disciplines of single thought. For the first time, people were put together into large institutions from all different disciplines. The intent was to have those individuals work together to co-create together. And it has happened. It happens all the time, but it doesn't happen at the level that, because of constraints of funding, because of constraints of reward systems, because of constraints of day-to-day life, it doesn't happen nearly enough. I think that people like Greg and I working together and thinking about how do we get our faculty together on a regular basis, how do we get our students together on a regular basis to brainstorm and to take on these challenges that face us is something that we can do. And we can do that by creating scientific commons. It needs funding, of course, but we should never look at money as a limitation in this neck of the woods with the incredible amount of wealth that surrounds us. It's just a matter of convincing individuals that this is a logical and meaningful thing to invest in. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, I was asked to repeat questions, so I'm going to do that. Right? Let's see if I can come up with a concise version. So, how can the management of federal lands overcome the challenges associated with distrust that exists between different groups, industry, environmentalists, agency? And there is an enormous amount of distrust. I think that I think that some of it is melting away. There's a lot of, in addition to mistrust, there is a lot of poor communication. And that poor communication comes from each individual group. They assume that they're at odds over an issue that they actually have shared interest in seeing succeed. And some examples of hope for the future are there are forest collaboratives that are being formed in areas all around the West. And these collaboratives are working together to find success in both the management of the forest, because the environmental groups are recognizing that the forest absolutely needs to be managed. For example, the Nature Conservancy acquired an enormous amount of land over the last 30 years. At first, they had a team of scientists ready to study the biodiversity of these things and watch this change over time. They quickly realized that these forests that were heavily managed, they bought, from example, Plum Creek, like just happened here in Washington a week ago, that heavily managed land, when then stepped away from and no longer managed, is not the natural forest that it was. So they've hired a bunch of forest management people to literally manage the forest in sort of restoring the natural conditions and function and structure within that forest. So there's collaboratives that are working on how do we restore these forests on federal land and maintain a milling infrastructure that can actually take the wood that's coming off of those lands. And so there are collaboratives between industry, NGOs, and citizens and agency. And I think that's moderately successful, but it's glacial. It's moving very, very slowly. I think that, from my perspective, I think that the forestry community, the forest management community, needs to step away from the perspective of that they're on the other side of the issue from environmentalists. They are actually environmentalists. A good forester is an environmentalist. A good forester is, by history, a conservationist. But we have a lot of bad examples to look back on and focus on, and that polarization pushed the foresters in the other side of the issue from the environmental group. I think that foresters need to say, okay, we are actually with you guys. We're part of the carbon sequestration team, not part of the carbon loss team. We're part of the habitat team, not the habitat destruction team. But it's going to take a change in perspective and also a change, somewhat a change in expectations for management. There's the bottom line that is the undoing of a lot of environmental and good forest management practices. So. Forests are wedded to clean water in terms of, if you have an intact forest, the forest is so important for filtering water, but it's also a major water user. And so people like the city of Denver, maybe many of you are familiar with this, undertook a clear cutting of lodgepole above its watershed a number of years ago to increase water, to decrease evapotranspiration and increase the flow into the city reservoir. It was a big mistake, but they had to experiment with it to see whether it would work or not. And sure enough, you do increase water yields because trees are enormous users of water, but they're also incredibly important in filtering and cleaning water. So to answer your question, an intact, functioning forest is going to be really important for our water resources. And given that those forests have existed on these landscapes for thousands of years, there's no reason to go and say, well, we need to cut these to change the water water resource. So my sense is that the sensible management would be of those forests is the most logical. I could go into more detail, but I'm a little nervous about the time at this point, Jay. So, yeah.
All right, well, join me once again. Thank you.
That's good.